Good afternoon and welcome to Lunchtime series where we add value to people's lives, happening every Wednesday and Thursday on ebizradio.com. You can catch the Lunchtime series on all your major podcast channels. And to help the channel grow, guys, and to add more value to people's lives, please follow, like, and share today's conversation. Because on today's coaching segment, we have back with us the human and talent-centered strategist, executive coach, agile people advocate, and HR and leadership expert, Anja van Beek. Anja, how are you doing?
Hi, Kevin. Yeah, doing well. It's cold here today. I don't know, it should be snowing somewhere in our country, but I'm good. How are you doing today?
Well, yes. I mean, I also woke up to a nice, fresh morning this morning. That's why I'm wearing my jumper as well. But I'm well. I'm well. It's been an interesting day for me. But I'm here and I'm ready, and I'm ready to chat about what we're talking about, and what we are talking about, right? EQ and the importance of why now it's so important now that we're returning back to the office. And we're needing to really step it up into a bit of better EQ for ourselves in a work environment. Anya, what do you think about this? Like, it's we've had this conversation. We know EQ is important from a leadership perspective, from a growth perspective, but more now than ever, I think it's almost pushing the button.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, Kevin, as you said, EQ is not something new. I mean, it's been around. I think if you think of that, there was a Harvard Business Review that Daniel Goleman wrote. I think it was in the 90s already, highlighting the importance of, as you say, EQ when you're a leader. But I think for me, it's more than just the importance of having a high EQ when you, irrelevant if you lead or not, as an individual. I think that self-awareness, that how do I regulate all these emotions? I mean, one of the realities that I have seen is people returning to work. It might not necessarily be a choice, their choice, to go back to the office. Now I suddenly need to interact. We haven't had face-to-face meetings. Everything is changing. But also then is, how do I spot those emotions in other people? And I think for me, a big part of EQ lies into that intrinsic motivation. How do I motivate myself? And I think especially, I mean, remember a while ago we spoke about this big resignation. And everyone, trying to figure out. So who do I recruit? Who do I need to, bring onto the team? So absolutely, as you say, I think more so than ever. I think that's twofold also, Kevin. It's because we have a human-centric environment where the focus on building those connections is so important. But then also where we find ourselves as humans, and in this weird place that we find, we called work nowadays. Yeah. It's so totally different to what we're used to. And I think that is where EQ is supporting us.
I think when we first, when we decided to talk about this, what I think, stands out to me so incredibly is we must, as employees, but as employers as well, from both sides of the coin, we must recognize that what we've been through has challenged our value systems to such a degree. It's challenged our reason for doing why we're doing what we're doing. It challenged where we live, right? Like people have moved, to the coast, or people have moved out of the city. I mean, I've moved out of the city, but based on the fact that I don't need to be in like close proximity to people. So I think, from an employee and an employer's perspective, things have shifted. Absolutely. And with this EQ, if you don't come to the party and bring your part as a curious individual that's slightly self-actualized, and really asking yourself the necessary question is like, do you want to be here? Is this working for you, for both of you as the employee or the employer? Mm-hmm. I think it's our responsibility to do that, because I think it shifted, COVID has shifted the narrative slightly for why people do what they do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what you mentioned is that being self-aware and to be very clear with yourself, as you said, What is it that I'm expecting in the moment? What is it that I'm experiencing? And what is it that I'm wanting? And I think the focus nowadays is so much. I find that people are a lot more self-aware than what they used to be. And for whatever reason. And I think that's great because, I mean, for us as humans, if we want to grow and learn, it starts with that self-awareness. And that's usually the blind spot for us. I mean, sometimes we can spot an emotion in someone else, but being that self-aware is not always that easy for us.
Yeah. I also think that because we've seen death so easily in the last 2 years, I think it's so easy to come to the party feeling heavy, feeling negative, feeling drawn down. And I've lost family. There's many people that have lost many things. But I think the flip side of that coin is people also need to start having some mechanism of happiness, that they understand what happiness means for them, and how that sort of plays out in their day-to-day lives, right? And that again to me also speaks about your emotional intelligence, because there's a world of difference between people who do their work with high energy and cheerfulness and enthusiasm versus people who begrudgingly come to work and they're just there because they out of sheer obligation. There's a very it's not very obvious, but when you can feel that energy, when people are there because they're just there. And now to add it, I used to work at home and now I have to be back at work. That in itself is going to create more unhappiness, right? So if I don't have a handle on how to fix that or how to get myself out of that slump, it's going to be difficult to be in that environment, and it's going to create more challenges for my work environment in any case.
Yeah, and Kevin, you've touched on about 3 things that I think is important for our listeners to understand. So the first thing is that where you say it's almost like that feeling of a little bit of heaviness, that feeling a little bit of sadness. And the first thing that we need to remind ourselves, and we might have touched on that last time as well, is that through any change, remember the transition curve, it's normal for us to feel sad. It's normal for us to feel that sense of loss.
Yeah.
But as you've pointed out, we need to take ownership of that. So the first thing that comes to mind for me, what I have seen, is that leaders are confronted with more emotions than what they've ever been used to. I mean, people or managers are usually very confident with, yes, people are perhaps fearful or frustrated, anger, but the sadness that we see sometimes in the workplace, there's an uneasiness about that. And I think, again, for leaders, if you're a team leader, to consider that when you experience, though, not you personally, but the team members, when it's visible in the team members, is to know that we're not therapists. That's not what we're here for, but that human connection is critical. So for us, even if you just acknowledge that, let's do a quick check-in and just hear where everyone is and connect human to human before we talk business. I think that's critical. But I think more importantly, as you said, is that we as individuals need tools. I mean, 2 words that comes to mind for me. The first one is that emotional agility. It's almost like, am I emotional agile in order to, when I have that sense of perhaps a little bit of sadness or some frustration, is not necessarily to just, put it there somewhere in the corner, but perhaps to acknowledge and feel that in order to, because I mean, we call it positive and negatives, but it's no right or wrong. It's really, what is this emotion trying to tell me? Perhaps usually when it's sadness, it's telling my body I need some rest, or I need to recover a little bit. Or perhaps the sadness might be, I'm vulnerable, so I'm open to hear some advice or get some feedback or support. So having said that, I think the resilience part for me is so important. And I love the concept of thinking of, you talk about high performance energy, and something simple as being optimistic, something simple as humor, something simple as just being grateful is like that springboard for high performance. And that's what we can take ownership of. Yeah,
I
absolutely.
absolutely love that. And as you're speaking, one of the things that also sort of springs to mind is confidence, right? A lot of the time, I think part of what I'm noticing in corporate is, um, because we're all in this COVID thing together. We're all in this aftermath of where the life has happened, and the recession and the world war and the petrol price. We're all there,
Yeah.
and there's an absolute need for employees to also become more assertive in how they take that approach, to also step into a bit of um, a confidence level of themselves and going, do you know what? I just want to mention here, I might have an idea, to really have the emotional EQ to kind of go, what if this could help, right? And to be able to put your hand up,
Mm,
and to help the team. What
mm,
I'm noticing, from a corporate perspective, especially with executives, is they don't have all the answers.
mm.
We employers kind of go, well, you're the bosses, you're the people with the title, so fix it,
Yeah.
and I think, um, a collaboration really needs to happen far more now, in companies, and it does. It requires people to be a little bit more assertive, a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more confident in themselves, and kind of go, even if this might sound silly, but what if we did this, right?
Mm.
Just to find a little bit of chutzpah in their approach, just to be able to share, because I think, the world could do with more optimistic, forward-looking, solution orientated brains.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, Kevin, as you were talking, I think it's absolutely, especially now with the knowledge economy that we're working in, is that the leader is not the one with the answers anymore. And I mean, the more you are open and the more you have the ability to create that environment where people can be courageous, because absolutely, like you say, I mean, I need to be confident. I need to be, I don't want to use the word brave, but perhaps there's a little bit of courage in there to say, I'm not sure. But as you say, let me put up my hand. Let's put this forward. And I mean, whenever I think of emotional intelligence, something that comes to mind is empathy. And that is why
Mm.
cognitive empathy is so important, because what does cognitive empathy mean? Simply that when we brainstorming and I'm bringing that idea, that the rest of the team can put themselves in my shoes and understand, based on my experience, based on my knowledge, based on my skills, why am I presenting that idea? And what's the benefit? Instead of just saying, no, it won't work, or we've always done it this way. And I think that is why, once again, the link back to empathy, and specifically cognitive empathy, is so important.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you and I, this is just how I experience leaders at the moment, is people don't know what that means. They don't know what it means to lead with empathy, right? And so if you are a leader out there listening, it's definitely something that you need to, again, from the intrinsic perspective, to look at self first and kind of say, okay, if I led with empathy, what did that look like? What does that behave like? What does it, how do I show up on Monday morning when I'm leading with empathy? Um, Another one that just sort of stands out around. Did you want to say something on that?
Yeah, so I want to ask you, so Kevin, if you have a picture of leading with empathy, how would you describe that?
I I immediately would become curious. For me, it's always about curiosity.
Mm,
When I walk into a building, and when there's acknowledgement,
mm,
and I mean, it's the one common denominator that we have as humans, is we all want acknowledgement. All of us, we all just want to be seen, right?
yeah.
So when you're walking into a building, and you acknowledge the receptionist and the security guard, you
Mm,
acknowledge the person that walks past you.
mm,
I went to a talk the other day, and it was so instinctive that my behavior did this. A gentleman walked up to me and greeted me because I was sitting at a table. I was going to be presenting at the table, and I instinctively stood up and greeted him, but standing. And I remember thinking, I think that in itself speaks true to leading with empathy. When you acknowledge and you respect, you don't just sit there and greet people. You get up, you greet them. There's a certain kind of demeanor that shows up. There's an unspoken manner that you come across. It's an unspoken tone of voice. It's a non-verbal communication that you're displaying when you're leading with empathy, right? And when you do speak, you also use certain types of language, right? It's not those people and those things and them and they and that, and it's a we. There's a we component to it. So I think, you know, you can actually create a beautiful picture for leading with empathy. But you have to be cognitive. That cognitive empathy that you're speaking of, I think it has to be a designed cognitive process that you're actually part of.
And
how do you see that?
So I will build on what you've said, because you've explained it so beautifully. And I mean, when I think of being curious is really to understand, to see you for who you are. But then the other part that I think similar would be the non-judgmental, because so easy we are to, without necessarily even noticing that we're judging, or we might be thinking something. And I mean, you've spoken about the nonverbals. And again, if we think of how we communicate, that nonverbals is so important. I mean, majority of what we perceive is on the nonverbal. It's not necessarily the words. It's how you, as you say, are you open? Are you closed? Do you stand up? Do I look at you as an individual? Whatever I'm doing. And I think, so I will just build on that, saying it's the non-judgmental part. And I think that Brené Brown, when she said people wants to feel seen and heard and respected. But the part for me, I think that stood out is they want to be seen. So do I have the ability that the other people or the other person feel seen?
And also, you know, there's an element to that puts me and my ego aside. You know, and I think that's, you know, often people have, because they have a title, because they are the managing director or whatever, they forget that it's just a title, right? If you put that aside for a second, empathy will show up easily. But if you walk in there as the managing director, empathy is not the first thing walking into the door, right? I think another one more point that I have on this emotional intelligence and why it's so important for today is self-regard, and speaking around, you know, how we see ourselves within an environment, you know, and what does my sort of inner critic look like, and how hard am I on myself? And this also speaks to my emotional intelligence around, you know, can I take good feedback? Am I able to get, or negative feedback for that matter, or critical feedback that could help me grow, could help me push forward? Because I think, again, coming back to the point I made earlier, we in a world that we need people to solve issues and challenges and come up with solutions, right? And if I say, you know, I disagree with you and that doesn't work for me, and for an emotionally intelligent person to go, okay, cool. So which part of that isn't working? What isn't sitting with you? What doesn't sit right with you? Or how do you see it? Or how do I frame it differently? I think it's very important for us to have that self-regard of understanding how you know, Oprah, I always quote Oprah on this, and she always like, I am 100% responsible for the energy I bring into this moment, right?
Absolutely.
So again, you know, having that regard and going, okay, cool. This is not personal. This is not me emotionally getting caught up in stuff, because if it is, you have to check that as well. But rather, it's a conversation that's been had, and this could potentially be a growth conversation, instead of you just giving me feedback and I fall to pieces kind of thing. I think self-regard, really important.
No, and what I can add on to what you've mentioned is, whenever I think of emotional intelligence, I think critical point is for us to know that it's something that can be developed. I mean, if you perhaps we have said something and you might sit there and you consider, perhaps I need to develop that. It's absolutely a skill that can be developed. But a very easy model that I always overlay with emotional intelligence is the clear leadership. I don't know if you've ever heard about clear leadership. And there they talk about the 4 selves of a leader. And it's actually, without realizing, it's a lot of the words that we've touched on today. So the first self of a leader, because remember you said it starts with yourself. The first self of the leader is, am I aware? They call it the aware self. So exactly like you said, do I know what is happening in the moment? What do I observe? What do I think, feel, and want? And then secondly is the descriptive self, is that ability to describe what is going on, because so often, because people
No, I laugh because we don't sometimes have the language, right? We know what we want, but we don't know how to say it. Like
exactly.
that description.
Yeah, the descriptive self. And because people are filling in the gaps, if you don't communicate everything, the descriptive self, I think when you think of EQ, is critical. And then the third one, as you've mentioned, when you talk about the empathetic leader, is that whole curious self. So let me understand, let me be transparent, let me be curious and really see where they're coming from. And then the last one, even though we have not mentioned that, it touched on perhaps a little bit of that self-regard that you've spoken, is the appreciation or the appreciative self. And that is, do I appreciate not only myself, or acknowledge, if that's perhaps then the better word, do I recognize myself and others for what I'm bringing to the table? Because I think for us, you mentioned about intrinsic motivation, but really to understand that everyone is bringing something else. That's why we such a dynamic team, because of our different strengths. But do you acknowledge and recognize that? And interesting enough, I've once read that they say, you recognize things, you recognize people for things that they do, but you appreciate them for who they are. And for me, that's such a subtle difference. Is, do you only get recognition and say, well done, you've made target, or well done, you've done this, but do you appreciate them for just the role or the energy that they bring to the meeting, or just the way that they have interacted with the client or the person that was shouting or whatever?
One of the things that I want to just add around what you've just mentioned about the leadership styles is communication, like how to check yourself on effective communication. And it's an acronym that I came up with, dealing with it so much in my, in the last couple of years with dealing with corporates. And it's the NAK. So do you have the knack for communication? And the knack simply standing for, is what you're about to share necessary? Is it adding value? And is it kind? And if you can answer all 3 of those, and you have yes to them, and it's a yes conversation, then you can share that information. But if it's not necessary, if it's not adding value and it's not kind, don't share the information, or change the way that you're about to share that information. Because again, from a leadership perspective, especially when it comes to acknowledgement and regard and taking people into to account, it's so important that you lead from a specific space, and how you communicate that is so important. So I mean, in summary of today's conversation, I love this conversation. We've already done this for 30 minutes, believe it or not.
No,
But in summary of this conversation, Anja, what do you think, the key takeaways of this is for you? Because I think emotional intelligence is being pushed to the foreground. We know that we're living in a world at the moment where empathy is key, where it's becoming about the people, and loving the people so that they would love the work, so that your business does well. It's flipped itself on its head in such a dramatic way. What do you want to leave with everybody around emotional intelligence?
So I think walking away with the following: to know that emotions is normal. It's there to tell us something. And that's why I love the first part that we say, to be aware and just to acknowledge what it is that what's the emotion that you're experiencing at the moment. And I always say, don't look at only the 6 emotions, the fear, the anger, the joy, whatever it might be, but go a little bit deeper to say, is it frustration? Is it annoyed? Is it, enthralled, or whatever it might be? So first of all, it's okay. It's normal to have them. to be aware, but then also to acknowledge if you're part of a team. You're not here to solve, but perhaps just to acknowledge for them to be seen. I would say that's what I would like to leave.
Absolutely. I love that. And, just guys from my side, I think what stands out for me is happiness. Um, it's nobody's responsibility other than your own to make yourself happy, and I think so. But you also find yourself in a work environment for 8 hours, 8 to 10 hours sometimes. You may as well make it a happy place, right?
Yeah.
So just like actively get involved with what does happiness look like and how can we do more of that, because it will make life easier. It would make everything we're doing easier if we lightened it up a little bit.
Yeah, bring in that human. I'm sorry, but there's one more thing that I think is critical to understand, is that if we understand where the emotion is coming from, and often it is coming from that conclusion or that story or that perception that we have in our minds. And if we can, by being curious, just open our minds, we might be able to create a different emotion, as you say, to bring that happiness back to the workplace.
Absolutely. I love that. Anja van Beek, guys, if you want to check out or get to know Anja van Beek a little bit more, she's on LinkedIn, and all her links are going to be in the description boxes below. Anja, thank you so much for joining me on today's show, and thank you for having this conversation. I love this. I think we could probably spend another hour talking about it because there's so much to unravel. But I think it's, what we've touched on is going to leave with some good nuggets of information and with the guys out there. So thank you for today, and I look forward to chatting to you in a month.
In a month, lovely. Thanks, Kevin. Chat soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Cheers for now. Bye.